I know more people are going to be streaming in, so let me do a little bit of housekeeping before we get started with Mickey. So December 9th, the new issue of Outlier magazine drops with Jesse Itzler on the cover. It is going to be on a billboard in Times Square this weekend, so we're excited about that. December 10th, we have our first ever mystery guest. I'm not going to tell you who it is. All I will tell you is bring your Kleenexes because you are going to cry. So make sure you join us on the 10th. On December 12th, we have a meetup in New York City. We're going to be skating in Rockefeller Center, or we're going to call it skating. I don't know how it's not going to be pretty, but we're going to have a good time. And then we kick off the year with our author spotlight is Shola Richards, who wrote this book, Civil Unity. Then we go to Atlanta for a meetup January 9th, followed by Dominique Wilkins' birthday party the next day on January 10th, also known as my birthday. And January 12th, we kick off our Legend series with the one and only Layla Ali, Muhammad Ali's daughter, and many consider her the greatest female boxer of all time. And February 20th, we have our humanity expedition to Nicaragua to support Peter Shaler and Rayo de Sol. So we're looking forward to that. If you want to go to Nicaragua, let me know. I'm sure, Mickey, I'm sure you want to go to Nicaragua, right?
I'll just say, don't make sure nobody becomes my client over there.
That's what we're aiming for. For anybody who's new to an Outlier Project event, our format is this. I'm going to talk to Mickey for about 30 minutes, like fireside chat, and then we're going to do 30 minutes of open Q&A. So if you have a question for Mickey, just put in the chat that you've got a question. Kathy will let me know, and then I'll tee you up and you can ask your question directly to Mickey. But I'm unbelievably excited for this. And I get excited, especially when we have a guest that I just don't know a lot about the work that they do. I know a lot about Mickey and I know about the work that he does, but in terms of like that life that he lives, it's such a foreign concept to me that it's just fascinating. So my curiosity is already going wild. So Mickey was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, so it's not too often you get to talk to somebody who was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. He manages relationships.
Nominated.
He manages relationships and private diplomacy efforts all around the world: North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, Middle East, Africa, etc. He's led his team at the Richardson Center to facilitate the release of more political prisoners than any organization. There's been articles and interviews about Mickey in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Boston Globe, Huffington Post. I could go on and on and on. He's been featured on CNN, ABC, CBS, Fox. I don't know. The NBC doesn't like you, Mickey. What's going on there? No NBC. We gotta fix that. He's the CEO of Global Reach, and he is the author of this book, which is like a Clancy novel, In the Shadows. It's unbelievable. So before we get into it with Mickey and we talk about In the Shadows, Kathy, get us started. Mickey, how's that for an intro?
I've never had anything like that before, I have to admit.
Welcome to the Outlier Project, my friend.
Thank you.
I am very, very grateful to have you here.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I have to say it's been the amount of link uh, reaches out. I really appreciate it from everybody who reached out. I didn't expect that. That doesn't happen. It says a lot about you guys, about the community.
We have a very engaged community. So Mickey, the last time I checked LinkedIn or ZipRecruiter, I didn't see a lot of job descriptions for fringe diplomat or hostage negotiator. Um, I mean, let's just start there. How in the world did you stumble upon this as your career?
Um, yeah, no, it's not out there, and hopefully there's no need for too many. But no, I did. I stumbled is the right word. I absolutely stumbled on this. It was about 2006. I was relatively fresh out of Georgetown, where I did my master's, and I was working at the Clinton Global Initiative at the time, doing some stuff there, and um, uh, Governor Bill Richardson was asked, unbeknownst to me, was asked by the Save Darfur Coalition at the time to head to Sudan and meet with the president of Sudan, Bashir. At the time, it was the heydays of the Darfur genocide. Try and meet him and try and get him to declare a ceasefire, a temporary ceasefire to allow the rebels to unite politically so they can negotiate. And when he started calling his friends to raise money for a private jet, because nobody wants to fly commercially into Khartoum, one of them told him, one of them who knows me because I worked for him before, said, "Oh, his name is Danny Abraham." He said, "Yeah, I'll give you money for your jet, but there's this young kid, Bergman. He does some work on Sudan. You should take him with you." And so it was a Wednesday morning, and I get the random phone call at my desk, and I have this like gruff voice on the other side. It's like, "Is this Mickey Bergman?" I said, "Yes." Yeah. "This is Governor Bill Richardson of New Mexico. I need you to pack your stuff and get your ass to Santa Fe. You're coming with me to Khartoum." And Scott, it's not only did I not know Bill Richardson, I didn't know the man existed at the time. And I had exactly 48 hours to decide whether this is a opportunity of a lifetime or the stupidest mistake I do before my head gets severed from my body, because not only I was not even an American citizen yet, not only was I an Israeli citizen, I was still an officer in reserves in the Israeli Defense Forces. And I made a decision after talking to some friends at the Clinton Global Initiative and of course my wife. The decision was that I will indeed fly to Santa Fe out of respect to this Governor Richardson, and I will explain to him the complexity of my situation and very nicely and respectfully bow out of the trip. And that was the plan, and that's what I did. I went to Santa Fe. We had lunch with the rest. There was the four people delegation, a very small group. And then after lunch, I told him, "Hey, Governor, can I talk to you on the side?" He said, "Yeah." And I said, "Look, I need you to know, not only am I Israeli, I'm an officer in reserves, and if things go bad, they go really bad. I don't want to risk the mission." And he just looked at me with this dismissive kind of look, like, "No, no, 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 you're coming with me. I vouched for you with the Sudanese. I told them I know you for 6 years. They have a problem with you, they have a problem with me, and we're all going to leave." And then he had this really, really juvenile kind of laugh on his face, smile on his face. Said, "Do you know what I'm famous for?" I said, "What is that?" He's like, "I get people out of jail. So worst comes to worst, you spend a couple of months in a Sudanese prison. Think what it will do to your career." And he's like laughing out loud. And the next thing my wife hears is me on the cell phone with jet engine sound in the background saying, "I have to go with this guy." And I went, and it blew my mind, because yes, he was governor at the time. He was still governor of New Mexico, but he went as a private citizen, and I was able to see what a private citizen can do using leverage that is not your typical national interest, government authority, but individual emotional leverage, basing on his relationship and his ability to connect, and was able to navigate that and get a ceasefire. It didn't last long, but it was enough for the rebels to unite. But that was something I came back with mind blown. And within a month, Scott, I realized he was running for president. He had a very short-lived primary run in the primaries in 2007, because the trip was December
Yeah.
2006, and then he announced in 2007. And that was the time that in Israel, there was a soldier taken hostage, or was held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. Only one back in the days. Little did we know about what's going to happen in 2023. And I figured out that I had enough connections, personal connections, to get to the Israeli government. I had enough connections through a colleague of mine that I worked with at the Clinton Global Initiative to Hamas. And now I had a presidential candidate who is willing to take risks on those things. And I sent him a little memo that said, here are the 6 steps of how you're going to bring back Gilad Shalit home. And he called me the next day and he says, it's a good idea. I said, thank you. He says, now go do it. It's like, me? I wrote it for you. He says, Mickey, I'm running for president. You staff it, I back you up. And that was the first case I worked on.
Unbelievable. In reading your book and in listening to you on various different forums, I think the thing that keeps striking me, Mickey, is the work that you do is so freaking complicated. You're dealing with families, you're dealing with governments, you've got to understand the geopolitical landscape of basically the entire world. You're dealing with all kinds of different personalities. How do you obviously you're incredibly bright. How do you educate yourself to be able to do the work that you do?
Um, well, first of all, I'm not sure I'm an expert on everything and all the geopolitics of the world. I have picked up and learned how you need to have the tools to become an expert very quickly in an area that you know nothing about before. My wife likes to tell the story that when I first went to Myanmar, that was in 2012. And I told her, yeah, I'm going with Governor Richardson to Myanmar. And she's like, oh my God, you're going to meet Aung San Suu Kyi. And it's like, yeah, she's on the list. And she realized that I knew very little about Aung San Suu Kyi at the time. And I had basically I had to do a crash course for myself on this very, very quickly. So it's a lot about the tools of how you learn about this. But one of the things, Scott, that is very, very important to me in this work, when I do a crash course like that, when I need to pick up Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, Russia, it's less to me about the geopolitics, because that we can pick up. So it's not about reading opinion pieces or any people having their opinions and analysis of it. Rather than that, it's trying to get genuinely into the shoes of those people that I'm about to meet, which means that I need to hear to get primary material. I need to hear them talk. I need to hear them doing interviews, because there is a certain way in which we in the United States have a really hard time. And as you said, it's very complex. We see the world very, I'm sure not this group, but in general, we see the world very binary, good versus evil,
Yep.
black versus white kind of thing. And as we all know, the world is way more complicated than that. And more than that, Scott, individuals are much more complicated. And in every individual, even individuals that are responsible for some pretty terrible things around the world, they don't wake up in the morning thinking, "Ooh, I'm evil. Let me see what evil I can do today." There's a certain narrative, there's a certain input that goes into their minds that gets calculated. They're very logical. They're not crazy. They're not irrational. They're very rational. But there's something that computes in their heads that explains and justifies why what they're doing is the right thing to do. And unless we figure out what that is, we will not be able to get anything tangible with them. And it's really important to remember in this, getting into their heads, and doing all of that and understanding what they're doing doesn't mean that we justify it.
Mm-hmm.
Huge difference. Sorry, I get excited. I digress a little bit. I have to figure out how to deploy empathy with these people. I have to understand how they see the world, how they see their role in it. And sometimes it's individuals, and sometimes it's a peoplehood. Like the North Koreans, it's not exactly all North Korea, but it's the elite, which is 5% of the population, the military and political elite, how they see the world, how they see their own role in it. That is empathy. Then I can understand how they're going to react to different things and how they're what's going to create leverage with them. The flip side of it, not the flip side, but the extension of it is sympathy. And sympathy is when you start actually aligning your own objective with theirs. And in my line of business, empathy is a necessity and sympathy is a trap. And people who are not used at exercising empathy conflate the two. So, for example, for me, I'm obviously I mentioned before I'm Israeli born. So I belong within the Israeli world. I belong to the pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace kind of movement. I always have been from teenagehood. For people who conflate empathy and sympathy, I become automatically for that to say, oh, you're a self-hating Jew. You justify Hamas. It's like I'm not justifying Hamas. I understand how they see the world. That helps me understand how I can approach and what it is that I can get from them, but also make it very clear to me what it is that I cannot get from them. I know I digressed a little bit, but that's kind of the way I look at it, though. So it's really focusing on the people, focusing on understanding people and culture, what it is that they see in the world, how they see their role in it, and that you can do with zero knowledge starting in a geographic location, and then you have to pick up very quickly. I mean, I have a case now of a hostage in Iraq. She's been held for a year and a half, more than a year and a half now, by a Shia militia over there. It's a horrible situation. I knew nothing about the politics of Iraq before, especially since 2003. And I had to become an expert in exactly who are the different militias, the dynamics between them and the prime minister, and the dynamic between the prime minister and the president and the clerics, and how that all of that moves in order to try and navigate that situation.
So, there is no standard plan for what you do. Everything is kind of bespoke to put these strategies together. And I know you've mentioned, in the book and in other interviews that in your 18 years of doing this, you've learned two things for sure. Share those two things with everyone.
Yeah, it's the two cardinal truths of hostage and political prisoner negotiations. The first one is that the deals never get better over time. They just don't. If we're lucky, they stay the same. Politically, we spin them. We try to make them look like, oh, the other side, we squish them. We got something else. In reality the reality is that the deals never get better over time. I can give examples of that in a second. The second cardinal truth is that time is the worst thing for the prisoners and the hostages. Now, we all know it, unfortunately, because the situation in Gaza just shows it, demonstrates it. I mentioned before we started, I was just off the memorial services of one of the American hostages that was that the IDF concluded that he died previously. When you're a hostage or a political prisoner, be it in Gaza, be it in Venezuela, in Russia, in all those places, any day you wake up in the morning can be a day in which you die of a disease or a violent act against you, or you attempt to take your own life in this. And all three of these scenarios happened, and I've experienced them in cases that I've worked over the years. And therefore, there's a sense when we try and negotiate and we talk to our government, and to others on this like, oh well, let's wait and see what we can do here, and that lack of urgency is one of the things that drives me crazy, and it's extremely frustrating, because even myself, I have dinner with my wife and my daughter every night here, and they are rotting in a cell or in a tunnel, and they might die. And you only realize it after it happened. And so that is the two cardinal truths of this, that deals never get better over time, and that time is the worst thing for the actual hostages in this. Yeah, and I can tell you, we can talk about Gaza, we can talk about Russia, all these deals, the Russian deal, even the exchange that took place on August 1st, that brought a whole chunk of them back, including Paul Whelan, who I wrote my book and concluded and published my book. Paul Whelan was still held.
Yeah.
Even though I've worked, it's the only case I included in my book that was not concluded before the end, before the book was published. And that was the reason, because first I knew that I believed strongly that he's coming home, but it was important for me that everybody sees, everybody that can read it, especially people in our government, to understand the progression of the Paul Whelan deal over the years. It started, the Russians actually took him because that was the time that the US arrested Maria Butina. If you remember the redhead spy, Russian spy, they took him. But our Department of Justice sentenced her for 18 months, and 12 of them were time served. So she had 6 months left. So the Russians kind of looked at us and said, well, 6 months, she can do that. We'll wait. And then they ask, in return for Paul Whelan, they asked for a guy named Konstantin Yaroshenko, who was a drug pilot, a Russian drug pilot that was arrested in Liberia and extradited to the US. And the US didn't want to do it. We could have gotten Paul Whelan in return for Konstantin Yaroshenko before the pandemic. And over time, Yaroshenko was released. He's a free man in return for Trevor Reed, who was not even taken at the time that offer was on the table. Then they wanted Victor Bout for Paul Whelan. The US said no, ended up releasing Victor Bout, the arms dealer, for Brittany Griner. And the deal for Bout just kept getting worse and worse, because that's what happens over time.
I'm going to get back to Brittany Griner in a second, but I'm curious, you talk about this, I think a lot of us think that our government should just put sanctions on these countries that are, bad players. But what's I thought was fascinating to learn is that the countries with the most sanctions against them, Russia, Iran, China, they're actually the worst offenders, when you would think that was a deterrent. Why aren't sanctions a deterrent?
Yeah, so you're exactly right on this, and we do have within our world of political prisoners and hostages wrongfully detained. It's the legal term used for it. There are repeat offenders, and those repeat offenders, you name them. It's Russia, it's China, it's Venezuela, and it's Iran. Iran has been doing it for decades. Russia has been picking it up. Venezuela has been picking it up. And China has had it mainly with dual citizens for quite a while. And yes, they are the most sanctioned countries. There is the simplest argument that goes, oh yeah, sanction them, punish them. That's how we deter them. But there's a flip way of looking at it. Since those countries are maxed on sanctions, and on Iran, there are thousands of sanctions on that country. Adding more sanctions, nobody's going to pay attention to it. Certainly not the judge or the guards that handle Americans, or the Minister of Justice, or whatever, whoever that is. There is a way to look at it that, at least in the case of Venezuela and Russia and Iran, they're using the hostage taken as a way to communicate with us, because we're sanctioning the hell out of them. Yep. And that is a way that now they don't get sanctions relieved most of the time for any of that, but they get communications. And when the US took Paul Whelan and we didn't want to negotiate, they took Trevor Reed. And we didn't want to negotiate, so we took Brittany Griner, and guess who was negotiating? And then we had a deal, and Brittany Griner came home. We still had Americans there. We stopped negotiating. So they took Evan Gershowitz, and they took Alsu Kumasheva, and we were negotiating again, and then we resolved it. By the way, there's still 26 Americans held in Russia as we speak right now. Deterrence is, even though it's not my job, because my job is to figure out those people, get close to them, and get people back home. And I can talk about how that is different from the traditional look at negotiations. I am engaged fully behind the scenes on deterrence policy recommendations. I'm a commissioner in a CSIS commission on specifically on that, and a bunch of practitioners from counterterrorism experts, ex hostages, and people like me who are working in this field. I have a very, very surprising and radical view of this when I talk about it in the substance of the commission. People think that because I deploy empathy that I want to be friends with everybody all the time. The truth is, I do know and acknowledge the fact that so many of the people and the organizations or the governments that I work with in order to secure the return of Americans are not honorable governments. And I do believe that we have a moral responsibility to do everything we can, as long as it's not existentially threatening Americans or America, to bring our prisoners home. And then when they're home, there are steps that we can take as a country that will put a dent at deterrence, not sanctions. I'm talking about indictments. I'm talking about debriefing somebody. I have an example. Danny Fenster, an American journalist from Detroit, he came back. We brought him back from Myanmar, from the military government over there. That was 3 years ago. To date, he has not been briefed, called for questioning by the FBI or any American agency to figure out who are the guards that wronged him, who are the judges, who was the minister. In this case, it was the home minister in Myanmar. I'm not talking about sanctions. Indict them for wronging an American. And because this is a national security crisis declared by the president, if we have an opportunity, you extract one of those people who's been indicted and bring them to trial. If you're able to do that, and it's complicated, and you can't do it in Russia, and you can't do it in Iran, but you can do it in Myanmar, or you could do it in Venezuela potentially. Lower risk, bring somebody up, that puts a dent. Suddenly you see guards, even if they're holding Americans, treating them nicely. You see differences in that, and that is something, that's part that is unspoken about. But I have to say that one of the things, Scott, and you hear that a lot, and I'm sure that it will be one of the questions here too. Mickey, you do, and you advocate for all these deals, and we have all these exchanges that are obviously not just, because we're releasing guilty people in return for innocent people. While by doing that, aren't we incentivizing the captors to take more Americans? It's the most common criticism of the work, and it's valid, absolutely valid. I don't want to negate it. I argue back on the moral perspective of it, that if we hold back on negotiations or hold back on doing deals to bring back our hostages, we are using our own prisoners as hostages to our inability to do deterrence. It is our moral responsibility, and I believe we're strong enough to do what needs to be done in order to bring them home and then build deterrence that is not on their backs. But we fail at that. They come home, we celebrate, everybody forgets. Nobody's willing to do the hard work on deterrence on the back end of it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Is that mindset how you can reconcile, Brittany Griner's, I guess, a pretty good example. At the end, the negotiation was, Brittany came home to the US. And for those who don't know, Brittany Griner is arguably one of the greatest collegiate women's basketball players of all time, played at Baylor, and then one of the all-time greats in the WNBA. And that hostage negotiation at the end, the person who we swapped for Brittany was not exactly an upstanding citizen, pretty bad dude. Is that how you reconcile it? That kind of mindset that the objective is to get Brittany home?
Yes, I mean the guy that we replaced or exchanged for her is Victor Boot. He's an arms dealer, and was in prison in the US for 14 years. When you look at it, doesn't seem like a just exchange. That's when you focus on Victor Boot. When you focus on Brittany Griner and you realize that for the sake of keeping this guy more years in jail, we're going to let an innocent American stay in jail, then you actually start challenging the morals of it. But I have to admit, This world, and especially my work, it's not a matter, there isn't a right or wrong decision. It's clashing of values constantly. Because is it possible that Victor Bout goes back to Russia and reignites his network and now is able to get weapons up that ends up harming other innocent people? It's possible. I will be naive and overly confident, not justly confident, to say no, absolutely not. There are mitigating factors. The fact that he was in the US custody for 14 years, nobody will trust him in the field anymore. But it is a complicated moral decision that we have to make on a case by case for this. My argument with this is that we are strong enough and we have enough capabilities within our agencies to make sure that we keep those people under tap. And if we need to, get them back. If we need to, get them back. And that's the part, but that's the part that is hard and complicated on deterrence. But yes, to your question, Scott, part of it for me on the values, and it's really, really tough to reconcile. I'll give you even a more extreme example of that. The Gilad Shalit, my first case, I mentioned it as we started, that was the soldier that was held by Hamas in Gaza. The negotiations or mediation from ours were successful. In return for him, 1,100 Palestinian prisoners were released for one guy, for one soldier. It was the only deal that could have been made. It was the only way to save his life, and it was Israel's absolute responsibility to do it. But one of these 1,100 prisoners was a guy named Yehi Sinwar that grew up to be the head of Hamas and the architect of the October 7th attack. And guess who was the punching bag for all of this? Gilad Shalit, the soldier. Because, for you, we released that, look what it caused. And I stand up tall and I said the problem there was not the deal. The problem was not the cost of the deal. The problem was what Israel did not do after Gilad Shalit came home and all these people have been released. Something that Israel used to be known to do. That no matter what the deal is, if you messed up with an Israeli, you get back in jail. And if you can't get back in jail, they take you out. Now, I'm not advocating for any violence use, but there were opportunities over the years, and we learned them since October 7th, to apprehend Yehi Sinwar since, and to apprehend any of the other released prisoners that re-engaged in terror. Israel chose not to do it for a variety of reasons, but to claim that the deal was the problem, was the source of all evil that led to October 7th, is really, really unfair, and it's kind of populist. But do I have to deal with it? Oh yeah, I wake up with it, especially around the month of October of last year, every morning, waking up thinking that this guy that I helped get out was in charge of this operation.
Incredible life you lead. So before we open it up for questions, I have one last question. I think I know the answer, but in these negotiations, I've got to believe that what is being said publicly and what's being said privately are very, very different. Is that the case?
That is about 1,000,000% the case. And a lot of it.
So basically, tune everything out that we're hearing because it is.
I wouldn't say tune everything out because then we don't follow the news. It's important but it's important to take it with a grain of salt. And for each and every one of you, I mean, this is a community of leaders in your own fields and lives. I bet that each and every one of you, in the topic that you're very familiar with, at some point there was coverage in the news, and you looked at it and you say, "Oh my God, that's terrible coverage." We all experience it when we're active in the world. And then you project from that, wait a minute, if that's how they're reporting on my thing that I know is inaccurate, what does it mean about the other things that I don't know about? And that is exactly correct. Now, it's not because of a conspiracy. It's not because of anything. Unfortunately, it's because of the way, I'm afraid, the way our media enterprise have been developing over the years in this. I remember as a kid, again, growing up in Israel, every hour on the clock, on the radio, there were these 3 beeps, on the rock, and there will be a voice that says, good evening, Israel. Here is the news. And it will be about 5 minutes of just facts. 3 soldiers were killed today in Lebanon, blah, blah, blah. In the US, whatever it is, the interest rates are facts. And then it breaks out and everybody starts spinning in the, in interpreting and all of that in the studios. But we lost that. And if we had that, even in my field, also you would see August 1st would be, good evening, America. Here's the news. 4 Americans were released today from Russia in exchange for 7 Russians, and you have all this, the details on it, not the spins, not who said who to what and who caved and who didn't, just the facts. It would have been way better for us to be able to consume the news, but I don't know of anywhere that we have that anymore. But it's a long way of saying, yes, everything is very partially reported. Again, I can tell you in Gaza, we're talking about how many times a week we wake up and there's something said, we're getting closer to a deal. We're waiting for Hamas to say this. We're waiting for Israel to say that. I can tell you, from October 7th to November 5th or 6th, we had a theory of return. That's the strategy that we build on every single case. Was extremely successful. 107 hostages came back. Since then, and specifically December 20th, there has been a single deal on the table that Hamas said yes to, that has been available, and Israel did not take it. And all the deals, all the things that you're hearing in the news, well, Hamas flexed a little bit. All of these are spins. The deal is exactly the same deal that we were in December last year as it is now. I know because I conveyed it to the Israelis from Hamas back in Doha in December 20th of last year. The only 2 differences is, one, we have way less hostages alive. As I mentioned, time is the worst thing on this. And second, the deeper Israel went into Gaza, the longer the list of things to be done in order to complete the list have become, complete the deal has become. So yes, most of it is noise.
Mickey, are you ready? We have a lineup of people out the door that want to ask you questions.
Bring it on.
Guys, try to make sure your questions are as concise as possible so we can get as many in as we possibly can. We're going to go to Colonel Scott Heathman first.
Hey, Mickey, it's great to meet you. This is fascinating. One of the models, when you talk about influence and trust, I use in some of my leadership training is the behavioral change model that was developed by the FBI. And I'm curious, do you have any relationship with Chris Voss and his negotiation techniques and tactics and things like that?
Thank you. So 2 things. One, in terms of that model and that type of work, I have to say, and I typically start it, so I excuse me for forgetting to say that. I look at negotiations differently than the typical average negotiations that we look at as a transaction, the give and take kind of part of it. I define negotiations, especially because of my work, but in general, as our ability to influence somebody else's behavior and decision making. So it's a broader thing, and yes, there's transactions and there's exchanges and deals in it, but it's really about influencing somebody's behavior. And in that is embedded the fact that it's not only about national interests, it's about personalities, and it's about characters and their motivations, not only at the top level, but everywhere down to the lower level, that everybody you engage with, how are they being evaluated? And to take it into a business modality for a second, you might be dealing with a salesperson. The CEO gets evaluated very different than the salesperson. And unless you understand how the salesperson get paid, get evaluated, and move their career, you're going to miss the whole thing of what you can achieve with him rather with the CEO. So yes, I'm a big fan of the human-centered approach to negotiations, Scott. And on Chris Voss, he teaches at Georgetown, where I teach too, even though different schools. And his book Never Split the Difference is a fantastic book. And I have this thing I say, like, most of the negotiators, the big time negotiators, like Chris Voss, like President Trump, again, not saying you like him, not like him, irrelevant for this. His book, The Art of the Deal itself, is a good book on negotiation styles. And most of the people who write these negotiations, if you follow them and if you follow Chris Voss's thing and to a T, you can be the best negotiator ever if you are him. And that is an important thing for me that I try to distinguish. There is a tendency of these negotiators that write the books to be of very certain personality. And all of us think about, close your eyes, imagine the negotiator personality. We all come up with the same thing. The person who can bluff, the person who can be a bully when needed, the person who can relate. All this, it's a very specific personality. And most of us are not like that, including myself. I mean, I sound very confident here. My confidence comes from my professionalism. If we were having the same group here and we talk on a different thing, I'll be sitting quiet and watching everybody because I'm an introvert. Except for where the places that I feel confident because that's my profession. I've been doing it for 2 decades. I can't bluff. I can't play poker. My face shows it. And so if I were trying to imitate the Donald Trumps or the Chris Vosses of the world, I will fall flat and fail because if I'm not genuine, it will be seen. I had to realize that about myself and adjust my style to that. And so I think that the problem I have with these books, it's not the books, they're fantastic, but the fact that they do two potential disservices. One are the people who are not like them, but are trying to imitate them, and they fail. And second are the people like myself who say, wow, I wish I could be that, but that's not me. So I guess I can't be a good negotiator, or I can't be a good leader, or I can't be a good communicator, and I leave the field. And we're losing a lot of great talent because there's no good or bad personality for this. There's no good or bad personality, period. But not for negotiations, not for leadership, not for communications. We just need to figure out who we are, get really genuine with this, lean into this. And if we do that, we can be very effective no matter what our personality traits are.
Such a fascinating answer. We're going to Massachusetts. Lindsay Dowd.
Hey Mickey, this has been extraordinary, and I'm doing everything I can not to cry because you're just tugging on all of the heartstrings from October 6th. So this is a two-parter. One, what has your involvement been since October 6th? And the second part to that is how can we stay optimistic about the situation there and the hostages having a chance to come home?
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. I'll try and answer it three-parter, so forgive me if I forget about it, but forget different parts. I'll try. I'm saying that to myself, so I know three things. First one, since October 7th, again, that's post my book. There's nothing about October 7th in my book, except for the Gilad Shalit negotiations that informed a lot of how I do this. Very quickly, I was approached by a whole lot of families of missing people. We didn't know hostages, not hostages, missing people. 67 came really quickly into this. And I only work on behalf of families at their request, of course, at no cost to them. We're a non-for-profit organization, but that's the mandate that I have. And we had to come up very quickly with a theory of return, which is, again, the script or the pathway, the shortest way that a hostage comes home. And in this case, we based on three assumptions. The first one, Israel and Hamas do not talk. So it has to be mediated. And even the mediation that I did for Gilad Shalit years before is not in the cards for this one. It's going to have to be mediated differently. Number two, there are 4 countries or governments in the region that can influence Hamas. None of them can control Hamas. That's a misconception. Hamas is a very proud, independent Palestinian program, but 4 governments can influence them, and that is Turkey, Iran, Egypt, and Qatar. And as you can imagine, none of them have any interest in helping Israel. But at least 2 of them have an interest in collaborating and helping the US. So the theory of return, therefore, was 1, we had to make this an American priority. Very quickly, very visibly, and at the presidential level. Once it was made that way, the mediators for in my case, Qatar and Egypt, because they want to work with the Americans, would be able to go to Hamas and say, look, we know you have this conflict with Israel, but this is about the Americans, our allies. We need to come up with a proposal for how to solve the hostage part of it. And once they solicit those deals, if they're even half decent, and they're never good, they're never pretty, they're never good, but even if they're half decent, then the American administration will work with the Israeli prime minister to make him as comfortable as needed in order to sign and implement. That was the theory of return. And it worked like magic. 54 days, more than 100 hostages back are numbers that are never heard of from this. And yes, it's 54 days too late. And yes, it was only 100. It's about half of the people that were taken, but still, it was a tremendous success and it worked. I have been doing this work, coming up with the theory of return, working with the administration, by the way, didn't need to push much on the president on this one. That was what we saw on October 7th was President Biden's DNA. That was it wasn't politics, it was him. And he met with families very quickly, and that was what was needed. The Qataris took that meeting, went to Hamas, and actually told them, before you even give us a proposal, we need a proof of concept. And 2 American women from the Chicago area were released at no cost, just to prove the concept that channel can exist. And then when the Israeli government approved it, I was in Israel to work with the families to get the Israeli government to approve it. Then I flew to Doha, and over there, I never sit actually at the formal table. I'm outside, and both sides, or 3 sides in this case, Hamas, Israelis, and Qatar, call my cell phone at the lobby of the hotel to test with me how far they can push the envelope without blowing it up. Because if you bring it up at the official table and it's too much, deal is done. And things like, Hamas never showed up every day. If you guys, those who you remember, every day they were supposed to show up with a list of 10 that will be released that day. And there were supposed to be certain categories. Hamas never showed up with what Israel expected, and Israel never showed up with what Hamas expected. But there would be different categories, different priorities, different kind of things on the Israeli side, different Palestinian categories of prisoners released. And there was a clear understanding that the moment, and that I convey that, the moment that Hamas shows up with less than 10, Israel is going to walk away. And the last day they showed up with 7, and Israel walked away. And I did everything I could to try and convince the Israelis to take the 7 and then walk away. I couldn't. There was a principle there that couldn't do it. Unfortunately, none of the 7 have survived since. But that was kind of the involvement, my involvement in the first part. As I mentioned, then I went back home to be with my family because there were 2 weeks of fighting. There was nothing to be done. Went back to Doha at the request of the Israelis, because the prime minister wouldn't send the head of the Mossad back to the negotiations, and they wanted to find out what is available so they can convince the prime minister to go back to it. So I did that, and that ended up in the December 20th deal that I told you about. And I tried to work really, really hard. The American administration has tried to work really hard to make the prime minister comfortable enough to do it. He was not. And I realized in early January that the fundamental calculation of the prime minister is opposite the deal. And so we started thinking, okay, what are the other things that we can do to leverage this? And over the next few months, we developed a different proposition that included focusing on the Americans that are being held, because that's the president's primary responsibility here. It's his constituents, in a deal that will look like it's bypassing the Israelis. And the idea behind it was not in order to leave behind the rest of the hostages, but knowing that if there is a pending deal that brings back the Americans, it puts the prime minister of Israel in a position where he cannot hold back. It's embarrassing to have President Biden bring back hostages while the Israeli prime minister cannot. The White House has been extremely cautious with this in an election year, knowing that it will be seen or portrayed as a betrayal of Israel. I think there were ways to mitigate that. And I think it was the responsibility of the president. But especially over the last several months, the White House allowed us to pursue this. And we are, and I can't talk in many details of it, but that goes to the last question, the last part of your question on this. Look, all hope is not lost on this. Unfortunately, for the hostages who died, it is. But we still need to get the remains back to their families as well. So there's still a deal to be made. There are still live and living hostages. There's still a way to get them. There's the larger deal that is still on the table, and there is a potential smaller deal that bypasses the humanitarian deal that might or might not lead to a bigger one. But for me, there's a Jewish saying: if you save one life, you save the whole world. If we can get any hostage that we can get out of this alive is a pure gain. So we're working on everything we can in order to do it, and these are actually direct negotiations with Hamas that we're doing, not through mediators. The last thing I would say, because we've been focusing on Gaza. Sorry, Scott, I answer a lot.
No, it's fascinating.
But I have to say that because we focus so much on the hostages and the price of this, it will be wrong of me to ignore or avoid what's happening on the other side of it as well. Because I'm Israeli. I feel the pain of the hostages and the victims of October 7th and the war. I have family there. My brother is out of his house for more than a year since. He lives up in the north on the border of Lebanon. That's where I feel the emotional pain of it. And I'll tell you a little bit of a story on this. When I was flying back from Qatar after the first deal was done and they went back to fighting, I faced myself in a 15-hour flight from Doha to Washington to be with my family. When you're locked in a plane, there's nothing else to do except that everything bubbles up that you experience over the last couple of months with this. And as I was boarding, that's when the first numbers started coming up from Gaza. 10,000 Palestinians dead. And I remembered that I thought to myself, there's no way. There's just no way. They're exaggerating. It's fake news. They're telling stories. And I forced myself to sit in front of my computer and watch videos from Gaza. And I had to retrain my brain to understand that devastation is happening. Doesn't matter if it's 10,000, 8,000, 12,000. It's happening. And once I did that, I was wondering for myself, why is it that my brain automatically went into this fake news move, that kind of thing? And I realized that it was so hard for me to reconcile that in the name of the country I was born in and the country that I served in the military for 6 years, such devastation can take place. It's just so hard to reconcile in the brain. And then I took the next step on this in my thought process of 15 hours flying. And I thought, is it possible that for the supporters of the Palestinians in the US and elsewhere, those who deny that October 7th happened, or that rape happened, or that murder of kids and all the atrocities that took place on October 7th happened, those who deny them, is it possible that they're denying it for exactly the same reason? Is it possible that in their young brains, the cause of Palestinian justice for Palestine, Palestinian statehood, the people of Palestine who deserve a right to live in safety and security themselves, in the name of something so pure, something so horrible took place? And that made me kind of stop and start giving a benefit of the doubt and allowing the space to have this conversation, and realizing that in order for me to express and feel the pain that I feel, I do not need to negate the pain to the Palestinian people, the pain since October 7th and the pain before. And the same goes to them. And I talk to both communities a lot about this from that perspective, realizing that we're all in trauma and our brains work differently. And recognizing that opens up the space to actually have dialogue, which we really haven't had since October 7th. Everybody's afraid. Even at Georgetown, I did a talk at Georgetown and said, be very careful, don't bring up Gaza. I said, no, I'm going to bring it up. We need to have this conversation. We need to understand what's happening in our heads so we can actually have a conversation. Sorry, I'll stop. I know I answered long man.
It's so fascinating. We're gonna go to Doug. We're gonna try to get as many in as we can. Doug, and then Robert Hamilton Owens.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Mickey. I know quite a few Israelis. I do business with Israelis, and your level of chutzpah is absolutely next level, my friend. This is unbelievable. To riff off of what you were just talking about, answering Lindsay's question, I did come across or read or hear on the news, I don't know, Trump's recent statement that I wanted to get your opinion on with respect to is it helpful or hurtful in terms of, I don't know what you want to call it, a threat to Hamas about all hostages needing to be returned, or there will be massive hell to pay before he takes office. I'm paraphrasing, but I think you're very familiar with this.
Yeah. Do you want me to go ahead or take a second question before?
No, there's no other question. I'm trying to be mindful and respectful of everybody else.
Yeah.
I could ask you 10 questions.
Yeah.
No.
Okay. No, thank you. Sorry. So I would say that first of all, on the two things. First is a quick one on Trump's statement. Look, I appreciate his intention in it. He's trying to be what the president was for what Reagan was back in the days when he said, "Oh, you solve the hostage problem before I come into office, otherwise it's terrible." If I'm a Palestinian, I'll ask you what additional hell can be caused in Gaza? Gaza is hell. It has been hell. So I don't know. They're looking at it, especially Hamas, and they're looking at it, it's like, what's the leverage here? What is really the threat? Remember, again, I talk about Hamas a lot and trying to understand how they see and how they negotiate. Both Hamas and Hezbollah, both leaders are dead now, but they were very open about their strategy. Their objective was the destruction of the state of Israel. They don't do it through occupation of Israel. Yeah, they had a tactical success on October 7th, but they knew they're not going to occupy Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. Okay, they needed to do it through two elements. One is the crumbling of the Israeli society from within, and second is the delegitimization of Israel internationally. A year into this, they've been pretty damn successful. Now, it's not done, of course, but there's dynamics that they saw and that they realized, because they knew the Israeli public really well, that will be created, that they played on. And these were just triggers to do that. And so for Hamas, and I'm saying that, trying to say it carefully, dead Palestinians, not a bad thing for them. Again, these are fundamentalists. The individual human life is not the highest priority. There is a bigger cause. These are martyrs to a cause. Unfortunately for me, that's a little sidetrack. I can say similar things about the current members of the current Israeli government as well. For them, the hostages are martyrs to a larger cause as well, which is devastating for me as an Israeli. But going back to Hamas, that threat to them is going to further delegitimize Israel. So I don't know that it's useful from that perspective. It is comforting for the families because they know that, okay, well, Trump is coming in. He's not going to forget about us. I hope that will be true when he comes in, and it's not going to end up being a deal that bypasses hostages or assumes hostages are dead and move on. The other thing I would say on this, Doug, just in the way that Hamas negotiates, I'll give you an example. I did a couple of times and it worked well. So let's say, Doug, you stole a glass of milk from me. Okay. Now you stole that glass of milk because you believe that my father stole the cow from your father that made that milk, whatever, that's on the side here. But you stole that glass of milk and I really want that milk. And I tried to grab it by force. And I kind of put my hands on it a little bit, but I miss it, and some milk spills and spoils. And I say to you, Doug, how much for the milk? And he said, Mickey, it's going to be $100. Because you're crazy. $100 for a glass of milk, not only a glass of milk that you stole from me. You're irrational. There's no way, no deal, nothing. But I really want that milk. And so I look around and I see that you have some cookies. So I go after you and I grab successfully one of your cookies, thinking, ha, all right, now that I have a cookie, for sure, I'm going to get the milk for cheaper than $100. And I come to you and I say, Doug, how much for the milk now? And you say, $100 and a cookie. And I go, you are crazy. You can't negotiate. You just increase the price. In this little analogy, I'm Israel, you're Hamas in the negotiation style. I'm focused on the transaction. I'm focused on the actual transaction of this. Hamas is focused on the picture of what it looks like at the end. And if you look at that, and if what I say is correct, then the more cookies Israel take from Hamas, meaning the more deeper they go into Gaza, deeper the cost that they inflict there, the longer the list and the longer the price will look in order to get those hostages back. And if we understand that, if Israel's objective was to return or get the hostages back home, the military incursion was counter to that. But that's not how it was sold. It was sold as if we'll apply military pressure and therefore Hamas will flex on their things. They never do. It's a fundamentalist kind of thing. They just don't do that. And Israel, in my opinion, one of the other things, again, Monday night quarterbacking or Monday morning quarterbacking, the phrase, sorry, it goes, Israel could have put Hamas after October 7th under siege, after they cleared up Israel from it, under siege, not go in, sit there, nothing goes in, nothing goes out, and say, until we have a hostage deal on this, and all hostages are back, nothing goes in, nothing goes out. As soon as Israel started invading, it served Israel's security purposes, other purposes other than hostages. I'm not arguing with that, but it did come at a price that was, they tried to portray it as it's all coherent. It wasn't. It was conflicting. So that's kind of a little bit of the spiel on Hamas.
Mickey, I want to be mindful of your time. Can you take a few more questions, or
Yes.
are we out of time?
Yeah, no, I'm good.
All right, Robert, you're up.
Hi, Mickey. This is fascinating. Thanks so much. My question is, when you work with staff or you talk to people, how many people naturally can understand the difference between sympathy and empathy? And how many people can grow into that place? I've done a lot of mediation and people just don't get it. And so you're always a bad guy if you empathize, and you try to be on the other side. Scott Heathman here understands that well. So how do you find yourself a loner? At Georgetown, do you find when you do a lecture, people get it? Or are you pretty much isolated that only people like you can figure out how to live in both those worlds and have a 15-hour flight and dissect yourself and put yourself back together again and go on?
Thank you for the question. I would say, first of all, on the staff level, working with our own government and foreign governments on this, unfortunately, emotional intelligence is very low on average, very, very low, because we train people in all of our schools. Again, I'm doing an exemption of those who focus on this, and at least even in Georgetown, and I teach emotional intelligence and international relations in Georgetown graduate degree because of that reason, because I figure we cough up, and it's one of the top schools in the country in international relations, we cough up graduates that can do a national interest analysis and presentation and policy recommendations like nobody else. But they don't understand people. We don't train them on that. And I'll say something about myself. Look, I'm an Israeli-born male. Emotional intelligence is not exactly our brand. I had to learn it. And I often talk about it, like, from Governor Richardson, I learned, for him, it was a gift. It was a born skill. He never intellectualized it. It was just, I would say, hey, what you did here was this. And he's like, enough of this riffraff kind of thing. That was because when you have it as a skill, you don't need to intellectualize it. I learned half of what I know from him and the other half from my wife. And my wife suffers from depression. and we had to work on it together for the last. We've been married for almost 24 years now. Sorry, almost 22 years. Don't tell her I messed that one up. I know her 24. As we were going through the struggles of depression, she taught me about emotional intelligence. She taught me how it is to try and practice to get into somebody else's brain, somebody who thinks very differently than you, and know how to be aware of your own emotions and what you bring into a conversation. Once, based on that awareness, be able to manage that, then be able to be aware of what are the others bringing into a conversation, and based on that awareness, know how to manage those relationships. 4 planes of emotional intelligence. And it is, some people are born with that, some people are not, and a spectrum of this, but it is certainly something you can improve on. And I'm sure that that's what you and Scott do in your life, as many others. It is something that if you practice, it's our brains, it's a muscle, it's a way of doing that. Emotional intelligence is like, the more you work on it, the more you're aware, the more you reflect, the more you look at your favorite movie and be aware of what the sensations are that you feel from your favorite scenes, the more your brain, the pathways in your brain expand, and the faster you will be at recognizing emotions in yourself and others and be able to manage them. And so, yes, I truly believe that it is trainable, that it's a skill that can be developed. Yes, like everything else in life, there's people with more talent, natural talent to it, less talent for it, but it is trainable. We just don't do enough of it. We absolutely don't do enough of it.
So my question is, at Georgetown University, when you explain that, do those students or those other professors want to go grow that gift, or do they just want to stay black and white and look at life the way they do?
Well, I don't have professors in my class. I have students. I wish I had. The former chair of the concentration thing, Nicole, was fantastic at that, and she wanted to bring that in a lot. When it comes to the students, it's less about lecturing them about it, but more of a practice. So in my class, what they're supposed to do when they write their little memos, it's 1.5 pages memo. It's a personality analysis of Putin or of Aung San Suu Kyi or of Kim Jong-un. It's getting and practicing into genuinely stepping into their shoes, not saying from an American perspective what we think they say, but what it actually is, and doing that research. And we have personality tests that we do, observer personality tests and things like that. So they start coming up with it. I can tell you that years ago, I used to do this thing. I haven't done it lately. I started the class with a shock and awe. And I would do, this was even before the pandemic, so it wasn't Zoom, it was Skype. But first class of my semester, I had a Hamas person on Skype talking to my American students. And they're not pandering to American audiences. They're arrogant enough to talk the way it is. And because it was remote, there was no fear in the American students to confront and to challenge. And we got insights into that. But it's the most shocking thing that you sit there and you don't fight, you're not arguing. You're having a discussion, you're listening. There's no point in punching, there's no point in winning an argument. It's purely for the sake of getting that information and then figure out, what do we do with this? How do we deal with this? So by practice of that, that's how I find the most effective way of doing it. And students are fully engaged in it.
You bet. That's wonderful. Thank you.
These answers are unbelievable.
Sorry, they're long.
No, but I'd love to get another question in if we can.
Yeah, let's do one last one.
All right, Melissa.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much for joining us, Mickey. Lindsay really covered a lot of what I wanted to ask, but I guess I do have a question, and it's more possibly your opinion than fact, or something you can definitely share. But and I know we've talked a lot about the hostages in Gaza, but for me, on a personal and emotional level, it's just been a really tough year. And I think what strikes me as different about that situation is that in most of the other hostage situations, we sort of know where the hostages are, right? And in this case, you've got babies, right? The youngest hostage was under a year when he was taken, and you've got senior citizens who I think are in their 80s. And do we even think we know where they all are? Like, that's just something that has always weighed on my mind.
Yeah, so there, yeah, it's been, look, the Gaza situation is unique on so many levels. The sheer numbers, it's not unique because we had the girls in Boko Haram in Nigeria, which was a similar number, but well, for me personally, of course, because it's my people, it's very, very different. It's the soldiers are from units that I served in, but these negotiations were under conditions of war as well. That also never happened before. And Hamas is certainly not in the business of letting us know who's alive and who's dead. It's like what's the Schrodinger's cat? You put a cat in a box and you leave it for a year, and as long as you don't open the box, the cat is both alive and dead. That's exactly what Hamas is doing with this, because the value of the hostages for them when they're unknown is greater. There are instances in which the intelligence community knows where people are, and they try to figure out risks in trying to take them. There was some heroic rescue missions that led to the release, at least 5 hostages that were released alive through these. Unfortunately, I know of at least 20 that were killed in these attempts. I look at the numbers and I argue with everything I can, even when one of these rescues released a hostage named Noah. And my daughter's name is Noah. And I was very close to Noah's, not her family because her mother was very sick, but it was her close friends that were working with me on this. And I was so emotional with her military rescue. But I also argued at the same time, it's going to cost dearly because it's going to cost lives of other hostages. Because as soon as you put on the table the threat that some of these hostages can be released in a military operation, the guards of the rest of the hostages, when the dog barks at night, will kill the hostage. Because if you look at the prisoner's dilemma or any basic game theory, the worst for them is the hostage being rescued alive. The best for them is a deal. The in-between, the Nash equilibrium for that on game theory is kill the hostage. And we know that happened as a result of that. That's kind of what one of the American hostages were killed specifically for that. And that's devastating. But also you look at the numbers and you realize like we got 107 of them in a deal and we got 5 of them in a military operation. Tell me which one is more effective. But again, there's things like the Bibas family. You mentioned the babies, Kfir, and his brother, and Shir, his mom, and Yarden, his dad, who's still in captivity. Hamas went to a very extreme lengths earlier to convince the Israelis that they're dead. Not Yarden, not the father, but the mother and the kids. The Bibas family it's a tribe. Like I work with, there are 20 of them that I'm in touch with, and they're all over the place on this. Of course, it's traumatizing. And there was a point that I actually thought that Hamas might have been pushing that narrative, not because they're indeed dead, but because they wanted Israel to move away or move on from them because they were with Sinwar. And they didn't want to release them because there was operational risk for them to release them or move them because that will tell where Sinwar is. So I was holding hope for that. I don't know what happened with Sinwar's killing because he was not with hostages, despite what the common knowledge was. But again, for Hamas to go to such length to convince the Israelis that this specific family is dead, there was something else about it. And this was at the time where Israel demanded that all the kids and the women will be released, non-soldiers, and Hamas wanted to move on into the next categories. So it's a long way of saying there's some places that we know, and the IDF tries not to engage there militarily when it's high risk, but in many cases we don't. And there was just a video released this week of Hamas citing and claiming a lot of hostages that were killed in IDF operations. This morning I was dealing with the Siegel family a lot. Keith Siegel is an American. He's one of the elderly men held. His wife Aviva was released on day 51. We worked on them because in that video, they make reference by picture to him as if he was killed, but there is no stating that he was killed. And we're just, you can imagine the trauma that causes the family and trying to deal, because we haven't had a proof of life from him since April.
Mickey, this has been unbelievable. It's been an education that is priceless for all of us. And I just appreciate you carving out the time for us. So I apologize for anybody who didn't get their question in. I have a solution. Buy his book. Make sure you write a review. It's phenomenal. And Mickey, you're a gift. God bless you for the work that you do. It's incredible. So thank you for spending this time with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you everybody for listening and bearing my long stories. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. Thank you again.